Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to this seminar here at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs on how the Russian regime is preparing for a transition of power. I'm very happy to see that so many of you have found the way here to NUPI this morning, and also welcome to our online audience who is following this seminar through the online streaming. My name is Helge Blakkesrud, and I'm the head of the research group on Russia, Asia and international trade here at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, and I will chair this morning's event. This spring I was taking part in a panel at our sister institute in Finland, the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, in a panel on the prospects for Putin's fourth presidential term. As you know, this is, according to the Russian constitution, Putin's final period as president. And the question of a transition of power is thus an important question that there are a lot of speculations about, both in academia and in the media. The star of this panel was Ekaterina Schulmann, and I decided there and then that I wanted to continue this discussion and bring it here to Oslo. And luckily, Ekaterina accepted the invitation to come here today. Ekaterina Schulmann would be a household name for many of you here in the audience, but just briefly, she is working at the School of Public Policy at the institution with a somewhat unwieldy name, the Russian Academy of National Economy and Public Administration, RANEPA, or RANHIX in Russian. She's a prolific academic, but she has also taken seriously the task of bringing academic insights to the wider audience through her weekly program at Echo Moskwy, Russia's most influential radio station. And I'm very happy to welcome Ekaterina here. She will speak for 45 minutes, and I've told her that I will try to stop her after 45 minutes so that we'll also have plenty of time for Q&A. We will have another 45 minutes for Q&A. But you have not come here this morning to listen to me, so without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to Ekaterina. Please, welcome.
Thank you very much. I was so enchanted with listening to descriptions of myself that I could just keep listening for some more time. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to Oslo. I want to thank all of you for coming here this early morning to listen to this, well, I would say rather engaging academic and political topic. It's true that this seminar was conceived, the idea for this, when we were talking about the aftermath of Russian presidential elections in Finland this May. So we decided to continue on the theme of the next presidential term, its agenda, and the next stage. This next stage, which is the topic of topics in the minds of the Russian political elites, in the consciousness of the political system in general, and the pertinence of this topic is exaggerated by the fact that you can't possibly discuss this publicly if you are a member of the said political elite. So what we will try to do today, we will try to describe the constitutional framework which actually encapsulates the situation. So we'll try to formulate the problem, and if there is a problem, of succession, of stability, of the transit of power as such. We will turn to the parallel cases in political regimes and systems that resemble the Russian systems more or less, and we will describe one by one the possible scenarios of the transit of power with their positive sides and their negative sides, with their realizability, so to say, and their possible consequences. I want to say at the beginning, if you expected to hear the successor named and the scenario of choice explained to you, then no. we, the political scientists, as you know, try to avoid predicting things. That's the most expected thing that people ask from us. What will come next? Who will be the next person? How much will the rubble cost? But we are not into the trade of prophesying, so we try not to make predictions, but we can analyze possibilities and we can outline scenarios. So, speaking of the transit of power or the transfer of power as such, what is the problem? And again, if there is really a problem. According to the Russian constitution, one person can occupy a presidential place 2 times in a row and no more. So the kernel of the trouble is just in these words, consequently, or in a row. President Putin, the incumbent, has been our president for 2 terms since 1999 to 2004. Then, from 2004 to 2008, then the then Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev became president for 1 term, for 4 years. During these 4 years, some changes were implemented in the constitution. The term both for the president and for the parliament was extended. For the president from 4 to 6 years, for the parliament from 4 to 5 years. And then the Prime Minister Putin became the president again in 2012. And he served his 6-year terms till 2018, and in March this year, elections held place, and he was re-elected for another 6-year term. So, de jure, he can stay in his place till 2024, and then something needs to be done. So, the simplest solution seems to be just to change the constitution. There is an example of China, our great neighbor, who, I must tell you, serves very much as a model for many in the Russian political elite and the decision-making class. China is seen as an example of the country who managed to preserve its integrity, its sovereignty, without the breakup that happened to the Soviet Union. This is not a new thing. These talks and these ideas about the so-called Chinese way or Chinese scenario were in the Russian public sphere since perestroika. We've been hearing about this Chinese example. And now we're hearing even more about it since 2014, because there is this idea that with the worsening relations with the West, Russia needs to turn to China and choose China as her preferable trade partner and political ally. How much of this is realistic? How much of this is translated into actual economic relations? I would leave to the economists. There is kind of impression that for the Russian political class, China is the imaginary childhood friend who has to be opposed to the bad guy, the generalized West, specifically to America. Again, how much of this is political and economic reality? How much of this is just ideological impressionism? I would lead to specialists in the field. My point is that the Chinese have just changed their constitution in eliminating this obstacle, this 2 times in a row rule. And this, of course, serves as very much a guiding light, or can serve as a guiding light to the Russian decision makers. What is the need to preserve the same person in the commanding place? How much the stability of the system is dependent on that person? That is not so easy a question as it would seem at the first blush. Political science generalizes and classifies political regimes into various groups. Science scholarship cannot live without putting things in categories. But we also know that categorization means simplification to a very great extent. And when we classify certain regimes together, we should keep in mind that there are certain similarities in behavior and in structure, in the mechanism of decision making, but still there are grave differences. Those of you who are familiar with political science are familiar with Barbara Geddes and her classification of autocratic regimes. It's the most widespread nowadays in both in academic literature and it has seeped into the media. It classifies autocracies as personalized autocracies where power is vested in the leader and his nearest surrounding. Party autocracies where the ruling party keeps its position by educating and rotating loyal elites within the structure of the party. Military autocracies or juntas per se, where power is vested in the military and the police. And sometimes there are added the so-called traditional autocracies or monarchies. However, the point that I want to stress is this. In modern political science, one of the most, I think, interesting and fruitful lines of development is the avoidance of this strict dichotomy between democracy and autocracy, which used to be seen as opposing poles that have nothing in common with each other. Now, more and more, political science tends to perceive autocratic and democratic elements ever present in the composition of any political system. And the question is the dynamic balance between those elements and the predominance of this or that part of it. What is called the iron law of oligarchy, the tendency of power to be concentrated in a small group of people, is indeed a law operating in any social group and in any country. This is the autocratic tendency, generalized. The tendency of people to want involvement in decision making, to want to decide issues which are pertinent to their life, to cooperate with each other. The generalized democratic tendency is also ever present in any society. So it's the business of democratic institutions to support this democratic tendency and to try to keep to a necessary minimum the autocratic tendency of power to be, again, concentrated in a small group. But we should keep in mind that both tendencies will ever be present in any system. This explanation on my side should serve the purpose to avoid this polarization. So Russia is usually classified as a personalized autocracy, or personalistic autocracy. This would be the most widespread formula that you meet, again, both in academia and in a popular press and in public opinion outside Russia, I would say. Inside Russia, you would meet with different and possibly, yes, diversified formulas for describing Russian political system. So, if we, for a moment, agree that Russia is a personalistic autocracy, then statistically, those political models do have a problem with the transfer of power for a very natural reason. If you do not have developed and self-sustainable institutions, if your mechanism of decision-making is dependent on personal relations, on people being acquainted with each other, on de facto and not on de jure, not on written rules, but on customs, then when the great natural law of generational change comes upon you, you are in trouble. Statistically, those types of autocracies have the average lifespan of 16 years. After that comes the transformation period. Again, statistically, personalistic autocracies tend to be followed not so much by democracies as by autocracies of other types, specifically military. Again, let me make this caveat. Regime statistics is a very useful tool for political science. But then it's good because it gives you a big picture. But it's bad because it gives you so big a picture. If your one item is a whole country, then your statistical mistake is pretty costly. And if 99 countries of this type behave in this way and your country behaves in another way, then it won't be a consolation to you that you're just 1%. So again, let's keep this in mind. Let us not, however, avoid using this tool, which can be useful. Regime statistics are heavily skewed by smaller countries. Latin America, Southern Africa, etc. They have usually very active regime transition dynamics, and so they get counted with the bigger countries. So again, just keep this in mind. However, this scenario of personalized autocracy getting old, military autocracy coming in its place, and military autocracies are, again, statistically short-lived. Their span is 7 to 9 years, and they tend to be followed by democracies. For some reason, not completely understood by political science, military juntas tend to hand power on elections, rather than personalist autocracies. Although at first blush, it would seem to be the other way around, so it's kind of counterintuitive. So, having said that, I'm not making this prediction for Russia at all, for specific reasons dating towards the end of the Second World War. Army is not an independent political actor in the Russian political system. Again, we will not go into details right now, just take this as a fact. Secret services and law enforcement are political actors, but the army as such and the navy, not to this extent. So this scenario doesn't look, as of now, a realistic scenario for Russia. However, we should keep this in mind because it's so widespread in similar models. Now let us turn to the question whether Russia is a personalized autocracy. And if it is, then what are its peculiarities? In what is it different from other autocracies or semi-autocracies or hybrid regimes of this type? Russia does have democratic institutions and democratic mechanisms. If you read the Russian constitution, you'll find it a very soothing and pleasant reading. I do it from time to time myself. It's a very good document. Maybe it's better than we currently deserve. So we do have a constitution which may be termed democratic. Federal legislation has changed greatly especially since 2012, in terms of tightening regulations in the sphere which is called in English public law. We do not have a corresponding term in Russian, but all the legislation which concerns political freedoms, elections, political parties, the media, the NGOs, the rallies, has been considerably tightened. That was the work of the previous Duma, done during the first 2 years of its term. I specify this because there's an illusion that these changes in legislation, this building of repressive legislative framework has been the consequences of Crimean events and of the general anti-Western turn of 2014. That is not the fact. The framework was there by spring of 2014. It was rather the reaction to the mass protests of 2011-2012. So the federal legislation is, to some extent, in direct opposition to the constitution. However, we do have regular elections. We do have a multi-party system with some parties which are not United Russia Party actually sitting in the parliament, having a few mandates between them. We do have some alternative media outlets. This does not make Russia a full democracy, in terms of Freedom House or Economist Intelligence Union. I, for myself, do not very much like these competitions in democracy, this points system when you get added the point or lose the point year by year, because this, again, this is generalization and simplification on too great a scale for me. However, they do have their points, those democracy ratings. They try to paint, to mark a certain tendency. My question rather is not whether Russia is a full liberal democracy, but whether indeed is the power vested in the person of the leader. What we know about Russia as a political model, as a decision-making machine, is that it is extremely bureaucratized. Russia is a bureaucratic state. Nicholas I, the Russian Tsar, used to say, it's not I who rule Russia, it's 30,000 stoloначальники, 30,000, well, people sitting at tables, the bureaucrats per se. Since then, these 30,000 changed to almost 3 million. And I think the phrase still holds good. I suspect in his time it was just the coquetry of an autocrat. But Russian life being so regulated, so overregulated, and Russian bureaucracy being so widespread, so numerous, and eager to regulate even more. In practice, it means that a large number of decisions has to be taken in any given moment. This in turn means that so big and complicated a system cannot be ruled by one person and his 5 friends. All those decisions cannot be made by a small group of people. The usual answer to this is that they make the most important decisions, that they send signals to the lower tiers of the pyramid. In a sense, this is the mechanisms of ruling anywhere. However, the point that I want to stress is that during recent years, we who watch the Russian decision-making model, the Russian decision-making mechanism in real time, we have seen this vertical of power, which even in the best of times was rather more of a propaganda picture than reality. We have seen this vertical of power, I would never say disintegrate, but suffer certain transformations. What are these transformations? The economic crisis, which started even before 2014 in the form of economic stagnation, this slower and then the almost zero economic growth, after 2014 led to the very concrete and tangible economic result, to the downward trend in people's real disposable incomes. When you say this, especially to foreign audiences, it doesn't produce much of an impression because Russia is habitually perceived as a poor country. So you think you have been poor, now you are as poor as you are used to. But for the people, what matters is not the objective level, but the trend, the tendency. Russians' real disposable incomes have been on the rise for 15 years. Let me make a pause here for this to sink in. It started with a tragically low level. It's still on a low level. We are predominantly a country of poor people, of low-paid employees, mostly. However, we had this upward trend, again, for 15 years, and then it went down. During the last year, there were some games around statistics. You may have heard, you may know that the State Statistical Committee is now under the Minister of Economic Development. Previously, it was an independent agency under the Prime Minister. So there were some shuffling and reshuffling of figures. However, with all this effort, I have not seen that they were able to make this level much below zero. So maybe we have seen a certain plateau in terms of people's incomes. So maybe when we count 2018 after it's over, we'll say that these incomes were not going down, but they were not, certainly they were not going up. The oil prices and the general prices of those resources which Russia is dependent on in its export also were, again, sometimes the prices were going down, sometimes they were staying still, sometimes they were going slightly up, but they have never reached the level of the previous rich oil years. What does this mean politically? It means that the system which is built on gathering resources and distributing resources among the elites and then diffusing it towards the people has a higher, well, a bigger problem with collecting these resources which it needs to distribute. It means more competition within the power machine. That's the biological law. Less resource base, more competition. It also means that the state of public opinion was bound gradually to change. I would not, again, go into details with the so-called public contract between the people and the state. You are making the economy better and we do not meddle in politics. I think this, again, is very much of a simplification. However, a certain idea that the country was going in the right direction and that the lives of people were getting better was the customary state of public opinion during the last 10, 12 years. When have we begun to see the changes? We have been seeing these changes since 2011. We have seen a certain state of public discontent which resulted in the mass protests of 2011-2012. Then it had no direct connection with the economy. Then it was rather the discontent of the urban classes who have felt themselves to be grown up enough and well-fed enough to remember that they have certain political rights. That was, in a nutshell, the reason, the mainspring of 2011-2012 protest wave. And then came 2014, which at the same time produced this wave of euphoria connected with Russia's external policy victories, perceived as such. And then almost immediately came the economic consequences. In terms of public opinion, we can put a very direct, we can point a very direct moment when this euphoria was at its highest. It was during the May festivities of 2014. So if you want to find the highest point of this Russian spring, as far as Russia internally is concerned, it will be this, May 2014. Then came autumn. Then came the falling ruble and higher prices and food anti-sanctions, which by this time are habitually perceived by Russian public opinion as being imposed by the West rather than the other way around. So then came the aftermath. What I want to make understood is the following. These subterrestrial rivers of public consciousness rather than public opinion were changing their course very gradually and very slowly since maybe 2008. This general process has different names with different sociologists, social scientists. Sometimes it is called the demise of paternalistic consciousness. Sometimes it's called the death of legalistic utopia. These are pretty names, more or less pretty, and again, more or less general. What the social scientists want to say is that it seems that in the minds of average Russian, there is a change in understanding the roles of the state and of the citizen, less expectations of state help and state patronage, some disappointment with the role of the state as a parent, which would be paternalistic idea as such. It does not take the form right now. It doesn't take the form of any rise of civic self-respect or whatever. It's rather a feeling of disappointment and depression. But we see, by the figures, by the data, less trust in the idea of the strong hand. Lesser numbers saying that strong hand and strong leader is what Russia needs. Less numbers for people saying that the state should be strong, more numbers for people saying that the state should be just. The word that came to change, to take the place of strength in the public mind seems to be this justice, this справедливость. This is a very complicated term. For those of you who are Russian speakers or know Russian, you will understand that this is the whole, it's a kind of an umbrella term covering a wide range of subjects. This justice sometimes means law, and sometimes it means mercy. Sometimes it means revenge. Sometimes it means equality. So it's a complicated term that can mean various things in various moments. But if we look to these bigger changes in the public mind, it's useful to keep this term before our eyes, because this is what will be possibly the keyword to future political changes, to future changes in popularity. So I understand that things that I'm describing may seem very vague. I could have shown you figures that support this, but I think that this general picture is exactly as much as we can say at the moment of what is happening in Russian society. So, in 2018, what happened? Rather, one more important thing happened in about the middle of 2017. This we also have seen from the polls, and this is what we may call the normalization of protest. What is this? People are asked the question, do you think that protest activity, such as going to the streets, mass rallies, what is called in Russia, meetings, I know it's a very different thing in English, however, whether it's a good thing in itself or a bad thing in itself, the state should suppress it or the state should allow it? In the middle of 2017, we have seen that the general number of those who rather say that protest activity is normal and should not be suppressed overreached 50%. Again, this may not strike you as a very great victory of democratic understanding, but still, if you keep in mind that the threat of Maidan has been one of the chief tools of Russian state media in putting down any sort of oppositional activity, especially the activity that deals with people actually going out to the streets. The always repeated song was, do you want it to happen like it did in Ukraine? Is it this that you want? You don't, then stay at home. And it was pretty effective because, again, propaganda tends to be effective if you have a monopoly in the information sphere. That makes it kind of easy. And because revolutions have a bad rep for Russians for understandable reasons. So in 2017, we have seen that this specific tool that has been so effective has kind of stopped, I wouldn't say it stopped working, but its effectivity went below 50%. This is what I would call the normalization of protest. I think it's one of the things that Navalny did by going out to the streets so often, by building this regional chain of branches of his organization. I would not attribute this result to him specifically, but I would mention his contributing to this process. It doesn't mean, again, that Russians are particularly eager for a revolution, for a forceful regime change or something. But they think that, they predominantly tend to think, that protesting is not a threat to public safety, but a normal political activity. It's interesting also to see the polls dealing with patriotism and how people understand patriotism. So when you are presented with a range of answers like patriotism means being proud of your country, patriotism means defending your country no matter what, patriotism means doing something good for your country, and understanding what it needs, even if it means seeing and proclaiming its defects. Then the last option reached, I think, almost 70% this year. So people tend to understand patriotism as an active position, as something that involves actually doing something. So there is this need, this desire for involvement, this desire for political participation, which gets no answer from the political system as it is constructed now. So, after 2017 came 2018 and the famous and well-known retirement age reform. And then came the specific changes in personal ratings of the president, of the prime minister, of other political institutions, government, parliament, governors, etc. So there is this idea that it was the retirement age reform which did this to the sacred ratings. But again, if I've been successful in trying to explain what I'm trying to explain, you will understand that this is not the cause, but rather the accelerating factor in the trend which was much older than the announcement of the pension reform. So, we will not go into the figures specifically. I will just mention one fact from the polls, which I think is significant. Since 2014, the presidential rating, the rating of approval for the president, got disconnected from other sociological marks, from ratings of approval or disapproval for other political institutions or political leaders. It was sometimes called, it was named the symbolic value of the presidential rating. So you could not say from the answers that a person gave you on the question if you support or if you approve the current president, whether he or she will also support or approve the economic policy, the state of affairs in the social sphere, etc., etc. This happened in 2014 when the presidential rating skyrocketed. And there were actually three people who were connected with each other in terms of rating dynamics: the president, the minister of foreign affairs, and the defense minister. They, the three of them, went together. First, of course, the president, then at respectful distance, those two. They symbolized Russian successes in foreign policy. And so, in terms of popularity, they went together. In the summer of 2018, we have seen the downward trend in the ratings of those three people together. So they went up together and now they started slowly going down together. I've been looking for the latest polling results after the announcements of changes in the retirement age reform, which were made by the president in August 29th. We do not have the newest figures yet. I suspect we'll see again some kind of plateau after this rather sharp downward turn in July and in the beginning of August. But again, we will see the dynamics. So, what does this all mean for the main subject of our conversation? What does it mean for the transfer of power? Again, to return to the beginning of our seminar, is there indeed a problem of this transit of power, or should we just change the constitution and leave things as they are eternally? If the goal of the system is stability, self-preservation, this seems to be the easiest way. In order to understand whether there is a problem or there is no problem, we should try to understand what is the role of the president for the political system. What does he do for them, for the ruling class, for the decision makers, for these groups of interests that constitute the Russian ruling class? What are these groups of interest, by the way? They are, again, mostly bureaucratic. They are directly or indirectly connected to the state. We have the bureaucracy per se, the civil servants. We have the armed bureaucracy, the secret services, the law enforcement. We have the army and the military-industrial complex, into which great amounts of money has been poured during the last, especially during the last 5 to 6 years. The peak of Russian military spending came in 2016, for those of you who follow the federal budget, and I would suggest that you do, because this is the lifeblood of Russian bureaucracy, and it's always useful to understand what they spend actual money on. So we had this peak, a very sharp peak in 2016. And then we had, again, a downward trend for 2017 and 2018. But still, even with these plans of lower military spending that we see in the budgetary project for the next 3 years, still we will not go lower than 2014. So we are still spending quite a lot of money on military. Then there is the economic bureaucracy, the state corporations, the state banks, the great state oligarchs of the present era. They will be the main beneficiaries of what is called the new May decree of the president, which is the great program of infrastructural spending delineated in a decree issued by the president almost immediately after the presidential elections of this year. Again, it entails great budgetary spending that will be directed to those who build roads, airports, bridges, etc., garbage burning facilities for the cities. And these will be these state oligarchs, the receivers of state contracts. Let us not forget this extremely influential and important group. Then there's the media bureaucracy, the propaganda machine, state television, and the great and unseen army of, well, I wouldn't directly say of internet bots, but however this system of influencing the informational field, the social media and the internet as such. So, what does the president do for these people? What, to put it bluntly, what do they need him for? I would say that he plays 3 important roles. He does 3 extremely important functions, which so far no one is able to replace him in. First, he provides external legitimacy. He, again, in their opinion, what I'm going to delineate now is not some realistic picture or my opinion of the state of affairs. This is my attempt to reconstruct the world picture of those within the system of power. So, what does providing external legitimacy mean? It means that he represents the system outside Russia. They have this idea that they won't talk to us in the West. They will just bite our heads off. But he knows them. He's been in the trade for almost 20 years. He knows how to talk to them. He will protect our interests abroad. So this is the external legitimacy function. Then there is the internal legitimacy function. The president is popular. He is loved by the people to a very great extent. With all the worsening figures that we have seen, again, the worst approval figure that Levada gives us in July of this year is 67%. Of those who view the president positively and approve what he does, and those who view his work negatively, 32%. These are very great figures. And this is supposed to be a problem because they're so low. So he wins elections, and he delegates this legitimacy to the United Russia Party, to the governors, to all the lesser bureaucrats who need to go through the election machine. Again, they think they do not know us, they the people, and when they know us, they hate us. But him they love. So he can go to this well of People laugh and draw a bucket full of living water and sprinkle the system with it so that it can grow green and flower again. This is the internal legitimacy function. The third function, which deals directly with the workings of the system, is the preservation of balance, of the equilibrium. We have mentioned that shrinking resource base leads to higher competition. If you follow at all the Russian internal politics, you will know of the sharp and cruel internal wars between the clans, between the groups in power. We, the public, we tend to pay more attention to those repressive efforts which are directed towards civil society, the media, the liberal side. But things these guys do to each other is much worse than what they do to outsiders. The prison terms are higher for those members of, for example, Siloviki community who fall foul of the system of their competitors. People get killed in jails. A lot of things happen, which I would not darken this bright morning by describing. So the war is there, all right. The competition is sharp enough. The role of the leader is to keep a very precarious balance between those competing parties. And again, most of these groups are either completely or partly the law enforcement and the secret service groups, the armed bureaucracy, the military bureaucracy. So what does preserving the equilibrium mean in practice? It means that no group should win a war over all other groups and become the first among the first. Even there should not appear two groups who have defeated all the others and now stand against each other, because that would mean the same state of affairs, one step back or in front, depending how you count. So, if you know this, you will understand a lot of things that are happening. You will understand, for example, why there is going to be no Ministry of State Security created by merging FSB and FCO. And why, for example, the investigative committee will possibly remain in place and not be merged back with the General Prosecutor's Office. Because you need more groups, not less, in order to preserve the balance. You will also understand why there is such sharp, competition within the FSB, and why the FSB departments tend to eat each other. Because, of course, FSB is the strongest security service, and it's the most natural choice for this first among all the others. So in order to preserve this balance, internal competition has to be maintained. So these are those three functions. Again, if I'm correct in delineating them. So far, with each of these three functions, we have seen that the president has been successful in doing his job. We have also seen that in all of these three directions, there are, let's say, problems. With the external legitimacy, on this I would not delineate again, because this is my topic. But you see that with all the talk of our great successes abroad, the sanction regime has not been going any lighter, but exactly the other way around. Relations has not gone any better. Personal meetings and even going to weddings doesn't seem to do anything very tangible. How far does this trouble the elites? I would not pretend to determine. I would not count on any internal coup happening anytime soon, because things that these people get by being loyal is much higher. Their profits are much higher than their losses, any losses that the West can inflict on them. And then again, go and read the May Decree. And you will read between the lines and even in the lines what the state has to offer if you remain part of the system. With the internal legitimacy, the presidential elections have been, from the point of view of the system, a success. Turnout has been pretty high. The results were such as they should be. So possibly on this front, they feel they're good. However, these changes in public opinion that I've been trying to describe, and this very visible rating drop that I have also named, and which they pay much more attention to than I do, may be perceived as a kind of threat. Again, to put it simply, a less popular president will possibly have more trouble in naming his successor if he has an idea of naming a successor. In terms of preserving the balance, well, the balance is still there. This is what we, the political scientists, are watching with very great attention. If there will emerge this one group that will defeat all the others, this will mean that the system is changing. So far, so good. We have seen this under the carpet wars, but we have seen the basic principles of the system still in work. So, what are the possible models of this 2024 scenario? This is the last thing that I will say, because they are, well, they're pretty few. Again, we have the Chinese option. Just change the constitution and go on with it forever. An obstacle to this will be, first, this specific legalism of the system, which tends to preserve the constitutional framework. This is quite typical. Political models resembling Russia's very much tend to go the legal way. This is called the legalistic tendency of a certain type of autocracies. Again, if there is no problem with changing the constitution, it could have been changed years ago, 10 years ago. There were no more obstacles then than now. But it hasn't been done. The system prizes stability. It needs to keep a certain semblance of legality. It is afraid to touch the framework of a constitution. Doing longer term is one thing, but changing the basic rules seems like maybe too much. And then there's the natural generational change thing. About 2021, we will see various demographic tendencies coinciding in one moment of time. It's the beginning of social and working life of the more or less large generation born in early 20s. We had exactly 10 years of high birth rates, 2004, 2014. When these strata of young people begin to be students and workers and voters, we may see some changes in the political climate. And second, the generation which overwhelmingly occupies the higher tiers of Russian administrative pyramid is the generation born in the 50s. People aged 60 plus, 65 plus. They will begin to, well, get less active one by one. This again is a kind of thing that you cannot avoid, no matter how you try. The average age of this higher grade of Russian bureaucracy, the so-called A and B categories of civil servants, the top and the deputies, the second and the first and the second tier, the medium age is 64. And even with the new young governors coming in, the figure has not changed. So the median figure is still the same. It's still above 60. The median age of Russian citizen of today is 39, also not young. And the median Russian citizen is age 39 and it's a woman. 2 children, lives in a town, in a city, in a city apartment, drives a car, by the way. Her name is Yelena Smirnova. If you are curious to know, that's statistic. The most widespread Russian surname is Smirnov, actually, not Ivanov or Petrov. Petrov is quite a rare name, in fact, but Smirnov is the most widespread. So this is Yelena Smirnova, who is absolutely unrepresented on any level of administrative hierarchy or in the parliaments or in the regional authorities. And we have this 64-year-old male with the upbringing in military or law enforcement or security services, who is our typical, our average Russian top bureaucrat. So this is so far as the scenario number one, the simplest one, is concerned. Scenario number two is the successor scenario, trying to play the same trick as they did in 2008. Even possibly with the same person, why not? If it went good one time, then it can possibly go good the second time. What is the problem here? The problem is the following. At some point, and I suspect that will be some time around 2020, the system in its collective mind will begin to perceive that the power that was vested in the current president is untransferable to any single person. They will not agree on a successor that will be, again, vested with all the plenipotentiary power which the current president, let's say, used to enjoy when the system was at its best, richest, and youngest. So they'll have to somehow divide those responsibilities. And this brings us to scenario number three. And that would be the empowerment of collective bodies, generally speaking. It may be the revival of the state council. We have such a structure. Now it's largely dormant. Or maybe empowering Security Council, which is an extremely influential body, even now. But it may be given some more public status. Or, who knows, maybe giving some additional authority to the parliament. Interesting things happen in the parliament. Interesting things happen in the account chamber. This is not the topic of our today's discussion, but this is my field of expertise and I'm watching it. And what is called in poetical language of political science the awakening of dormant institutions does show some signs there. A kind of a subplot to this scenario of empowering collective bodies will be, and this is, I understand that this is very much hypothetical, and if it comes to be realized, it will be a very risky scenario, but still. It's possible to reframe not the constitution of the Russian Federation, but the, for example, the union of Russian Federation with Belarus. And then, for example, elect a union president. Again, this now sounds like a scary fairy tale. But still, again, if I were you, I would watch the Belarusian direction. This is not my, again, not my field of competence at all. This is foreign affairs. So I'm not touching this in any great detail, but still I can perceive something moving in this line. So my last point is this. The system will try to use its collective brain in searching for the scenario that will ensure its survival. Again, the simplest path seems to be just let things go on as they are. In real life, there's quite a lot of time till 2024, but the system cannot live in the state of uncertainty till 2024. By 2021 at latest, by the next parliamentary elections, it has to understand what the next path, the next turn will be, or it will not be able to operate. So by the time the parliamentary elections will be held, there must be an understanding in the minds of the decision makers of the ruling bureaucracy as to what will happen next.
Thank you very much for sharing your insightful analysis. We then have to wait a few more years to know the answer, if this was correct. But we have now 30 minutes at our disposal for Q&A, and I'm sure there will be many people that want to pick your brain here. When you sign up, when you get the microphone, rather, please introduce yourself. And I have a first question over there, Paul Kolstø.
Paul Kolstø, University of Oslo. Thank you very much for a very stimulating and interesting talk. I would like to start with three of the things you mentioned, which seems very obvious. One is that you said that the Russian political elite or system, they want a major concern is to stability to reproduce themselves, right? And secondly, that the president is, at least it was until this spring, extremely popular. And thirdly, that all regimes are sort of somewhere in between autocracy and democracy. So my question would then be, why cannot the Russian regime move slightly closer to democracy by allowing a person like Navalny to run for presidency? And I would think it could boost the legitimacy of the political regime you have today. So as we remember, in 2013, Navalny was allowed to run for the mayor in Moscow, and that is the most liberal city in Russia, and he could garner 27%. So if he was allowed to run in the presidential elections this year, he would definitely have less, and Putin could show that I can really survive also and in a democratic system, and that would boost his legitimacy internally and externally. So, but there's something which keeps them back from doing that. Why?
Why? It's a good question. Yes, we have seen that the presidential elections were held according to the principle of non-admission. So there were no alternative candidates. Now that elections are passed, let's just put it frankly. It's what was called in Russia the Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs scenario. And now we see that, again, meaning no offense to other respected candidates, but still. Now we see the same scenario repeated on the mayoral elections in Moscow. I was rather suspecting this will be the case, that no oppositional candidates will be registered at all. And this is exactly what happened. Why does the system behave in this way? Maybe they have different ideas of their own popularity than we have, according to the data we possess. Maybe when you keep growing, you become kind of risk-averse. And so you do not put yourself in jeopardy when you can help it. So the idea may be that they do not need this boost in legitimacy. Rather, they would not risk giving a legitimate outlet to the opposition. Again, if we look at the mayor of Moscow elections, the only way that an oppositional candidate could have a chance to be registered would be if the incumbent, the current mayor, had competitors within the system strong enough who would think that he shouldn't have it too easy during his own elections. But then the collective mind of the system decided that safety is more important, that we need to pass this barrier as quickly and as quietly as we can without taking the risks. And about the democratization scenario that you mentioned, by the way, the empowering of collective bodies idea that I have mentioned will in practice lead to less monopolization within the political system and to more, more voices being heard and more outlets for involvement being created. So in reality, this will lead to such results, not immediately, but in the, middle-term perspective.
Okay, we have the next question over here. Microphone is on its way.
Good morning, Henrik Seip, Equinor. We used to be called Statoil until May. I have two questions after your excellent presentation. One is, are you confident that the transition of power post-Putin would be peaceful and orderly? or might we see upheaval? Second question. I would like to draw a brief comparison to Kazakhstan, where, as you know, there has been constitutional change which would allow for current President Nazarbayev to be the supreme leader of the country in his capacity as chairman of the Security Council, whereas somebody else could in due course be elected president. People have speculated whether this is something to emulate for Russia, and I would like to hear your opinion on that one. Thank you very much.
Thank you. About peaceful or non-peaceful transition. As of now, at this moment, we see by all sociological indicators low levels of aggression in the Russian society. This tolerance towards dissent, the tolerance towards protests, does not mean any desire for violent upheavals. We have quite good figures on violent crime. Violent crime has been going down for the last 8 years. We have lower alcohol consumption in Russia, the single best thing which is happening to Russian society right now. And this corresponds to all the other indicators, from traffic accidents to domestic violence. We have polls and scholarly investigation of values of the new generation, of the younger generation, and they are all very much against aggression. You may call it passivity, you may call it conformity or whatever, but we are an aging society with predominantly female population. The older the demographic strata, the more women are there. So again, as of now, it doesn't look probable that there will appear some violent movement. However, demography influences political processes but doesn't determine them. If that were the case, societies with similar demographic pyramids would behave in the same way, but this is not so. Ukraine is a very natural comparison. Ukrainian demographic pyramid is slightly more rounded than the Russian one. They have not sustained such heavy losses during the Second World War, although they did their own fair share. But still, if you look at those two pyramids, you'll see, smaller youth groups in Russia, less males, more females, etc. However, in order to orchestrate any violence, you do not need a majority. You need a minority, a strong group, an extremist group, or whatever. So, again, I do not see any signs, either in the elites or in the populace, of the non-peaceful scenario. But that does not mean that it should be completely ruled out. But again, no signs as of now. The second question, the Kazakhstan scenario. Yes, of course. I have mentioned the changes that would, again, empower or create new collective bodies or empower the existing ones. The Security Council or the State Council or the Parliament or all of them in some degree. Or even creating a new role for this Russian-Belarusian Union. All these would be more or less similar to what Kazakhstan is trying to do. Another thing that Kazakhstan is trying to do, which I would love to see us emulate, is giving more authority to the parliament. And moving kind of towards a less presidential, more parliamentary republic. This may be one of the ways that the Russian political system will develop. They are looking at Kazakhstan as they're looking at China, as they're looking at Uzbekistan, where you know what happened, as they're looking at Kyrgyzia. So they also do their regime comparative studies.
So a retirement position for Putin in an influential body, but then diversifying power, spreading power between different groups in a parliamentary model. Next question is from Tor. And then I have Julia, gentleman over here, and Ingrid.
So Tor Bogård from the Norwegian Defense Research Establishment. I have two questions. And the first one is, in the beginning of your presentation, you talked about the decrease in paternalistic values or attitudes in the population. Do you see that as a result of increasing Russian urbanization? Because if that's the case, then it's to some extent maybe a irreversible process. So that's the first question. And then the second one is when you talked about the balance of power between different interest groups in the elite. Could we see, for example, until 2021, 2022, that the FSB actually tries to become the one on the top, not necessarily displacing the others, but because this was kind of, but being the one on the top above the other ones, because this would also to some extent clarify what would happen after 2024, then it would be FSB in some variety that took power. Thank you.
About changes in values, why do they happen, whether they're the result of urbanization. Urbanization process is still going on in Russia. 74.2% of Russian population lives in cities and towns, Rosstat tells us. Since the 60s of the last century, we are no longer an urban society. However, this process is still going on. People move from countryside to the towns, from smaller towns to bigger cities, and from there to the two Russian metropolis, Moscow and St. Petersburg. So we have those centers of concentration of people and the economic forces and the financial resources, which are the big cities and the agglomerations. Yes, of course, this affects values. This brings on develops rather, a new mindset, more independent, more self-reliant, I would say. However, this decrease in paternalistic values has also been a result of disappointment when people had expectations of the state, but it didn't deliver on these expectations. So it seems such a natural and indeed irreversible process because so many factors contribute to it. And what would possibly change this movement? Well, if we suddenly enter into the era of universal basic income and the state starts distributing pensions to all the society and demanding obedience in return, then we may have the kind of communism that no one expected. But this doesn't seem to be the case right now because the very opposite is taking place. About elite groups and the FSB, I have mentioned FSB is, of course, the first among equals of the armed bureaucracy community. Their predominance is moderated by internal competition within the FSB. It's not a coherent unity. It's a conglomeration of departments and centers ruled by their own heads, overwatched by deputy heads of the service. And they have, well, they also have quite sharp competition within them. We have seen whole departments eliminated, their heads arrested. You may recollect the case with the Department of Informational Security. It was the story popularly known as Дело Шалтай-Болтая, the affair of Шалтай-Болтай. Again, it's as engaging as anything in crime fiction, but I will not go into details here. Just Google it. You'll be engrossed in the story. So, if indeed, for example, we'll see FSB swallowing up some other security service, then it will mean that there are some basic changes to the way the system works. Again, as of now, no, we do not see this. But yes, we are watching this service with very great attention. One small thing I will add. You may have noticed, if you follow the Russian press, for example, that there are quite active discussions about some liberalizing of anti-extremist legislation. The infamous Article 282 of our criminal code, prison terms for riposts, as it's popularly called. These discussions have actually never stopped since this article have been in force. However, after the presidential elections, they were more vocal than ever. And there is an understanding that the current political bloc of the presidential administration may have this idea of what they call normalization. Less toxic propaganda, less political criminal cases, again, some softening of the legislative base, etc. So far, it has not been a success. Again, we are following these developments. Maybe during the autumnal session of the State Duma that will shortly return to work after the vacations, maybe we will see something happening. So far, no. Why is that? Because the Siloviki community is against it. And it's extremely difficult to take a piece of bread out of their jaws once they have started eating it. In previous times, this political bloc of the presidential administration used to rule the internal policy in Russia. Now it's no longer the case. The alternative decision-making centers have appeared, and they are mostly, again, within the law enforcement community, so it doesn't look like very much like a democratization process. But still, this is the reality that we have to deal with.
I don't think it's on.
In?
No,
It
now
should
it's
be on?
Yes.
Okay, I'll start again. Julie Wilhelmsen, I work here at NUPI. I had a follow-up on the question of paternalistic values, because you said that there is a move towards greater, what do you call it in English? Sprawiedliwości. There's a kind of a demand, a growing demand. And I was interested, could you tell us, is there any regional differences, or could you expand a bit on what that is and what it looks like in the different regions, in particularly the Northern Caucasus, if you have any information?
Russia is a big country. Let me tell you this, I'm an expert. You have to trust me. And it's extremely variegated. Yes, the differences between the regions are sometimes greater than the difference between the Russian region and the Western European country. So we have the central Russia, the urban Russia. We have the northern western territories, which are usually more prone to oppositional voting and who tend to dislike Moscow for a number of reasons. Once you go from Moscow to Yaroslavl, for example, you come to this specific country. Even St. Petersburg is slightly different from Moscow. By the way, there was a mention here, I think, when I was asked a question about Navalny, that Moscow is the most liberal city. Moscow is a city inhabited by civil servants. It's a loyalistic city. The ratings of approval for Russian foreign policy are higher in Moscow than in the regions. Please keep this in mind. Moscow is a rich city. It's inhabited by people who benefit from the state budget and from the current state of affairs in general. St. Petersburg, again, is slightly different. Then we have the agrarian south. The Krasnodarский край, Ставропольский край, Ростовская область, Volgograd. It's the region of agriculture. It's the rich regions with very specific political culture of their own. From time to time, accidents like those of Kushevka surface and show us a glimpse into how power and money and organized crime and local authorities are all merged there. Some of you, I think, have been in or around Stavropol. So these places politically resemble Northern Caucasus much closer than they resemble Central Russia. Then there are regions of Far East and Eastern Siberia. Depressive, higher crimes, higher alcohol consumption. There are whole oblasts in Russia who are economically dependent on prison facilities and penal colonies, like Republic of Moldova, for example. So we have this very different, very variegated Russia. The place for traditional values per se would be, of course, the agrarian south. Again, that should sound kind of familiar. I think it's more or less the same everywhere. We have the coastal America and the metropolitan America, and we have the hinterland. It's more or less like that in Russia. However, Russia is predominantly an urban country. So I would not look very much into the exotic intricacies of regional consciousness. Watch the bigger cities. They are those who decide how the country will move. Northern Caucasus is a very special place all of its own. What I can say from my viewpoint is that it's heavily dependent on centralized budgetary funding. So far as this is going on, they will be loyal. When we'll have, and if we'll have some problems with that, we'll have some problems there also.
Here. Pass the microphone.
Hi, thank you very much for a good presentation. My name is Adilshad. I'm master student of public international law, University of Oslo. My question, recently was killed the head of Donetsk Republic. What is the future fate of Donetsk and Lugansk regarding to Russia, and how long Russia will support these two republics? Because under the public international law, it's territories of Ukraine. It seems like Russia supports separatism. You know. And second, you said about Kyrgyzstan that same regime with Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, but I'm from Kyrgyzstan. We have changed the 4 presidents. It's a more democratic country than others of Central Asia. Okay, thank you.
I have said nothing of this kind. I mentioned Kyrgyzstan as one of the countries where regime changes have taken place and that the Russian decision makers are watching as well as they watch. Kazakhstan, where there's one scenario, Uzbekistan, where there's another type of scenario, the successor scenario, which ended, as you know how, with taking the predecessor's portraits down, and there's the Kyrgyzstan scenario, which is much more turbulent one. About your first question, I cannot give you any answer. I do not follow Ukrainian politics, nor do I very closely follow what happens in the eastern territories. What I can say from my particular viewpoint, there is a great difference in the public mind between the Crimean affair and the Eastern Ukrainian affair. The Crimean story was seen as a fairy tale come true. It is still perceived like that. It's seen as a natural, peaceful thing that should have happened long ago, and at last it happened. The Eastern Ukrainian story is put out of the public consciousness. People don't want actually to hear about it. There is an understanding, as far as I can catch, especially in the external audiences, that, well, Russia would like to get rid of eastern territories, but cannot do so because of the public opinion. It's the other way around. These things are important for the decision makers because, again, of the specific composition of our administrative elite. For them, it's an important and a personal matter because the set of values that they have kind of makes them into this. They are predominantly from the military and from the law enforcement and from the security, so they should care about things like that. They care very much about the impression that they make abroad and the not showing a weakness thing, etc. So it's not like the president will lose or diminish his popularity if suddenly tomorrow Russian TV news stop showing news from Donetsk and Lugansk. There is no such thing. Again, it may be some psychological flaw or responsibility on the part of Russian people, whatever. I'm not doing any judgment here. What I know from the figures is that Russians predominantly don't care for what happens there. It's seen as some kind of complicated and dirty and expensive story. And by the way, people get more and more irritated with the idea that Russia is spending money abroad. This is a very toxic issue now. They say, and we see it from focus groups, we are feeding the Syria like we used to feed Cuba during Soviet times. They are all getting fat on our money, and we are sending money there and there. Sometimes they even say that Crimea cost a lot of money, and now we have to do this pension reform thing. Again, this is all focus groups. It's not the taxi driver that told me that. I do not talk to taxi drivers on political matters. So this is the only thing that I can say about the subject.
I have 2 more names on my list, so I suggest that we take both of those questions. Oh, you got the microphone already, and then you skipped Ingrid, but we'll go back to her after. So, Gunnar, please.
Okay, thank you. My name is Odd Gunnar Skagestad. I am an old age pensioner and independent analyst.
And a former
Madam
diplomat.
Schulmann, I noticed your very eloquent formulation at the outset that we political scientists tend to avoid making predictions. I'd like to challenge you on one point, though. It's about the economic situation, economic development. You described the stagnation in the Russian economy, the stagnation, no economic growth during the past 4 or 5 years, I suppose, something like that. And you mentioned specifically the sanctions and, of course, the drop in the oil price. Now, I'd like to add one element. I think the most important matter in the stagnation of the economy is the concentration, the gradual concentration of power in the hands of the rent-seeking elite that's taken over most of the main enterprises. You can call them Mr. Putin's new oligarchs, if you want to, and which has been an obstacle to value creation, an obstacle to productivity. I wonder how you see this as a driver in the political conditions that may influence the succession issue. Do you see this development continuing, or any prospects for a change in the developments of the Russian economy? Thank you.
And we'll just add on the question from Ingrid. If you pass the microphone back.
Ingrid Oppdal, Institute for Defense Studies here in Oslo. In how you described the system within the elites, there are some very powerful mechanisms for stability there, just because everyone is so interested in a very stable system, and I think many people, and including myself, would agree that this is not a very volatile political system. Quite the opposite. It is also rather conservative. But how resilient is a system that relies so much on balancing between interests in the face, for example, of external shock, or in a rapidly changing environment, for example, in the regions? So there are some sources of vulnerability. Could you elaborate a bit on those?
Two small questions to be covered in 2 minutes.
These are good topics for another 2 lectures.
I think we have to invite you back.
About concentration of resources, yes. I think that the single worst thing that happened to Russian economy is not the stagnation, but the statification. The state has predominantly become the major employer. State directly, the so-called бюджетные организации, healthcare and education and housing services, and state corporations and state banks. This, by the way, was the reason behind the presidential elections being held the way they were held. If you have noticed, the mobilization of electorate by administrative means happened not per region as previously. Previously, it was the business of governors to bring people to voting polls. Now, the mobilization happened per employment place, and it was the business of employers to tell their staff to go and vote. Because these people work for the state either directly or indirectly. Monopoly is bad, competition is good. This is one of the basic laws of political science, if there is a basic law to political science. I have mentioned the power groups, the so-called state oligarchs, as the beneficiaries of the new May decree. You know the names. We all know the names. You may read the lists of those who receive state contracts. There will be more of this. Not more people, but more contracts. And more money in this so-called state-private, частно-государственное партнерство, state-private partnerships, as it is called, in building infrastructural projects. And this leads us to the second question, to the stability within the system and to its resilience to external and internal shocks. Well, hybrid systems are hybrid for a reason. They enjoy some of the advantages of having democratic mechanisms. and democratic institutions. They also enjoy the benefits of having some of this simplification of decision making, which is the feature of authoritarian model. They are rather stable. The survival of the less effective autocracies is a new feature which modern political science is very much curious about. Well, there are some extreme cases like this, the one of Venezuela, which is the political regime with not just zero, I would say negative effectivity, one of the least workable political systems in the world, and still they manage to keep the power. How do they do that? Open borders. First, whoever is dissatisfied can leave. Whatever money you have spent on the police and the army. And what you have left, spend on TV propaganda. Again, Venezuela is a small country. It has a different economic model. We are much, much better off. No comparison whatsoever. But still, my point is that in our very peaceful time, when neighbors don't grab each other land bits, well, not that often, and where violent revolts have stopped being popular most of the time, there are opportunities for survival, even for a much, much less workable mechanisms than the Russian one. And it must be said in favor of our bureaucracy that it more or less does its job. It can do a number of things quite effectively, not just big projects like football championship, but infrastructure, transportation, connectivity. It does it quite well. It knows where it needs to avoid meddling so as the economy can work for itself. External shocks that you mentioned, I don't know with a country as big as Russia what this external shock can be. Foreign invasion? The sanctions have can be only so far effective as to prevent further exuberance in terms of foreign policy, but not to shake the system inside. Something happening in the regions, sudden protests. Again, this is a topic that cannot be touched upon so lightly. It needs more detailed explanations. Still, no system lives forever. And stability is, in a sense, an illusion if you understand it as unchangeability. In its quest for survival, a hybrid system is liable to change so far as to become almost unrecognizable. We have seen these changes going gradually on from year to year. And then you just notice that things are different from what they used to be. In a long-term perspective, I do think that for a society, an urban, educated society like Russia's, composed not of agricultural workers or industrial workers, but mostly of people employed in service, people employed in office work, people employed by the state, I think that gradual democratization is the most natural scenario, and that it will happen, not because somebody decides that it should happen, but because there is a demand on the part of the society for more involvement. We have seen it on municipal elections. We have seen it in mostly on local level. We have seen it in the so-called thought sector, in the NGOs, who work under great pressure, but still they develop. More and more people get involved in charity. More and more people get involved in cooperating together for various reasons and for various causes. So again, by 2024, we may see not a completely different, but a slightly different in some significant points, a more mature society. Again, less paternalistic, less interested in news from afar. And this we see even now. People are rather irritated by the predominance of foreign policy agenda, for example, on state TV. There were very interesting figures after the presidential address to the Federal Assembly. People were asked a question, what topics were given too much attention, what topics were given too little attention in the address. The topics that, in people's opinion, were given too much attention, 46% named it what? Military and the arms. And too little attention, economy, poverty, social sphere, healthcare, education.
As you know, for the last 20 plus years, we have organized our annual Russia conferences here at NUPI. And I would like to remind you all that on the 14th of September, we will have this year's annual Russia conference. Topic is going to be Russia and the Arctic. But I was going through my notes the other day, and I discovered that in 2006, we had called our annual Russia conference Towards a Post-Putin Russia. 12 years on, we're still talking about the same issues, but I'm very happy that you had the time and opportunity to come here to Oslo and
I think I tried to avoid personalities. And
yes.
mentioning
yes.
names.
Yes.
We need rather to pay attention to institutions.
I
and
think you
groups
had
than to
provided
persons.
us with some very important nuances to our sometimes being too preoccupied with the person and not with the institutions surrounding them, and some very good nuances. So thank you so much.
Thank you
For sharing your insights. Thank you.